Cairo is the largest city in Africa and the capital of Egypt. Egypt itself was unified and began around 3100 BC, so Cairo has a long history on the land around the Nile River. Once divided into Lower and Upper Egypt, the first pharaoh Mena brought them together and established his rule at the new capital of this unified Egypt, in Memphis, located on the border of the upper and lower sections of the Nile River. It was located a few miles southwest of the current location of Cairo. Being the main source of fertile land for agriculture, civilization naturally grew around the Nile River. Yearly, the Nile River would flow and was essential for a good harvest. In addition to providing arable land, the Nile was an important trade route as people could travel long distances quickly down the river. Most cities were built on the east side of the river since the sun rose from there, symbolizing birth and life. Most tombs were built on the west side of the river since the sun set there, symbolizing death. The first settlers of Cairo built a Roman Babylon fort in the area, and a small town of mostly Coptic Christians gradually grew around the fort. Arab invaders took control of this town in 642 CE, and it became their permanent base. They built the first mosque in Africa at that time. In 972 CE, the Fatimid dynasty conquered Egypt and built a new capital north of the Arab settlement. The new capital was named Al-Qahira or Cairo. The Al-Azhar Mosque and University were both built during that same year, and to this day Cairo remains a center of Islamic learning and philosophy. In 1517, Egypt was absorbed into the Turkish Ottoman Empire, but in 1914 gained independence. Nasser became president in 1956, being replaced by Vice President al-Sadat in 1970 after his death. In the years that followed, there was much political and social struggle for the Egyptian people. Islam is the official religion of Egypt, and most Muslim Egyptians are part of the Sunni sect of Islam. The Copts are the most common Christian denomination. While the official language of Egypt is Arabic, many people also learn English and French. There are several Arabic dialects spoken in Egypt, and Cairo has its own. Because the modern film industry is heavily based in Cairo, its dialect is understood throughout the Arabic world. Since 96% of Egypt is desert, the area around the Nile River is intensely controlled and funded to produce the highest yield of harvest possible. Egypt's main crops are cotton, corn, rice, wheat, sorghum, and fava beans. The Arab music education tradition is both oral and oral. There is room for individual improvisation and interpretation. The primary identifying factor of Arabic music is the tonal system. One octave contains at least 17 unequal notes. There are different modes that are used, or maqam. Rather than having a continuous beat divided into sections, there are different rhythmic measured periods, or wazn, and there are variations in these. Instruments such as the oud, nai, kanun, darabuka, and reek are used to accompany singing. The voice plays a major role in Arabic music. Even in modern music, these traditions are generally still adhered to by musicians. Arabic music, and specifically Egyptian music, has experienced thousands of years of history and development. Until the 20th century, music was only taught orally and orally. Because of that, studying its history and styles and pieces takes a creative approach of studying primary resources, writings from outside its local population, and especially understanding its intent and reception if there are few recorded descriptions of sound or music theory. The three repertoires that we will be discussing are the Kion, Wasla, and Taksim. The Kion were both free and slave women who were trained in the art of song, dance, poetry, calligraphy, and shadow puppetry. The Wasla is a compound form that provides an underlying order of a long stretch of a performance that elicits a deeply musical experience for both the performer and audience. A taksim is an unmetered improvised solo on an instrument with a certain maqam. A maqam is a collection of pitches like a mode, and it also contains pitch sets that are commonly played motifs within each one. They begin in the lower part of the ajnas, which are the tri, tetra, and pentachords that make up the bases of a maqam. Generally, there are two ajnas combined to make a maqam. And then the player is able to move to any part of the maqam after the first few measures of establishing the tonality. The Kion were famous and influential musicians from the time. They wrote verse and established new rhythmic ways to sing in Arabic and various melodies and performed with well known instrumental musicians. Their work and performances, sung with the tonal systems and texts of the era, shaped how Arabic music handled tonality in recitation of verse years later. Taqsim came about from the order of performance in Arabic music, and it is a part of the wasla form. Muhammad started the Islamic religion in 622 after receiving sets of divine revelations, for which he eventually found followers in Yathrib, present-day Medina. After the death of Muhammad in 632, his successors were called the caliphs. Within decades, they conquered Egypt, Syria, Iraq, and Persia. Having captured slaves from many areas, they brought together several cultures and music traditions. The slaves readily displayed their musical talents and created Makan song festivals, during which they showcased their songs, improvisation, singing, and playing techniques, and new instruments. The caliphate and religious leaders did not approve of these festivals and self indulgent conduct, so they strove to limit musical expression. They claimed it was based in the Quran, but the text does not explicitly prohibit music. Despite this eventual effort to quell music being performed, the first few decades of the 7th century, musicians could still perform music in public easily, while keeping in mind they needed to practice some prudence. Women had long been performing musicians in Egyptian culture, as far back as the 14th century BC. The Kion, or professional female singers, were popular and experienced public renown. The Kion existed in pre-Islamic times and were both free women and slave girls. Not only were they singers, but they also kept the company of men, composed music and wrote verse, told stories from history and literature, wrote calligraphy, and performed shadow puppetry. Azat al-Maila and Jamila were the most well-known singers from the time. Azat al-Maila and was educated by two famous Kion. But one of her main accomplishments in her career was taking over two Persian singers' melodies and altering them to fit new Arabic texts, and as a result created a new kind of rhythmic and metric song, Muwaka and Mauzun. She recited Umar ibn Abi Rabia's poems of mostly erotic verses, and he was reportedly so intoxicated by her performance that he tore his clothes and became unconscious. Not only was she a charismatic performer, but she taught many students who went on to become famous singers as well, such as Ibn Mishra and Ibn Surayi. Around the year 700 was when the professional female Kion singers were at the height of popularity, but Egypt continued the music tradition beyond many other countries. A large portion of medieval Arabic female poets' work in treatises, books, songbooks, and records that have survived come from the Kion. There are no recordings available of the Kion performing, but their sensuality and musical prowess were a huge part of their popularity. They were well educated and performed for the elite as well as some public performances. They told stories and sang about a plethora of subject matter. They wrote verse and wrote in calligraphy. They were more than just musicians, and they influenced many musicians and poets from the time, including classical Arabic instrumentalists. Wasla, literally meaning extension or stretch, was a compound form that shifted with the changing popular genres. Wasla is a composite form comprised of separate genres all tied together by one maqam. If the first genre performed was in Maqam Bayati, the rest of the individual genres began and ended in Bayati. Often, performers move between modes within each piece according to how that was customarily executed in the genre. Early 20th century Egyptians maintain that the wasla in its most well-known form was developed in the late 19th century. They were mostly performed in a sara, a musical event held at night, usually held during a wedding ceremony, for nearly half a century until they gradually dissolved to almost never being performed after World War I. The performers in a wasla were mostly male and were made up of a mutrib, a male solo vocalist who was generally the star of the group, a sheikh, a man with religious training that was associated with Sufi music, the Sanida, a chorus of 4 or 5 men that accompanied the mutrib, and a takt, a group of alatia or instrumentalists who traditionally played the kanun, the oud, the nai, the reek, and the kamanja, a spike fiddle that was eventually replaced by the violin in the late 19th century. The specific genres that were played within the wasla changed from performance to performance. The intent was to perform popular genres of the time in a unified maqam that led the musicians and audience to reach a state called sultana, where they would deeply experience and be fully mentally enveloped in the maqam. Many poets and composers of music written written for this ensemble are not recorded, and that music is usually referred to as kadim or old. Beginning as an introduction to the mood of the maqam for the audience and other musicians before moving on to the metrical composition, in the 20th century, musicians began to view the taksim as its own self-contained musical form. A taksim is a metrically performed improvised solo based on a maqam. It gives the performer a chance to demonstrate their skill, musical prowess, virtuosity, and creativity in their musical expression. Takasim are usually referred to in relation to their associated maqam. For example, they are called Taksim Bayati or Taksim Rast if they are written in those modes. To begin the improvisation, the player generally plays in the lower ajnas, which are the tetra, the pentachords, the first couple notes of the actual maqam, and they play in the lower ajnas of the maqam to firmly establish the tonic note and then begins to extend beyond to other ajnas to unfold the maqam. And be creative with how and which pitch sets and cadences are used. As the solo goes on, the player will switch to other modes in as clever a way as possible in the maqam and go back to the original modality by the end of the performance. There are often several phrases and noticeable breaks taken between the phrases. The nai and oud are commonly used instruments for takasim, and takasim is a plural word for a single taksim. The kanun is another instrument used for this form as well. The modern kanun is a zither with 26 string courses, each containing 3 strings. The instrument is well tuned for the Arabic tonal system and is a challenging instrument to master. This is an ancient Egyptian artifact depicting a small ensemble of 7 musicians who are seated. There is a flute, clarinet, and arched harp player. Seated between the 3 instrumentalists are 4 chironomists. They are all holding their right hand in the same position. The meaning of this is not known. The chironomist to the left is holding his hand against his ear, indicating that he's singing. Around 3,000 years later, and many Arab singers still make that gesture while singing. The way in which the flute and clarinet hold their instruments is the same way modern musicians hold their instruments. Vocal and instrumental music has long been combined in Egyptian performances. From the 14th century BC, this Egyptian mural depicts 3 female musicians playing the double oboe, the long-necked lute, and the arched harp. The playing style is shown accurately amongst the musicians. It is clear it is a double oboe and not a double clarinet because the 2 pipes are not tied together but are inserted into the mouth separately. The finger holes on the double oboe are not clearly visible. The musician playing the lute uses a plectrum to strum the strings. Possibly a turtle shell, the sound box is covered with some sort of skin. The neck is nestled into the skin, and it has 6 frets possibly made from strips of gut tied firmly around the neck. The tassel located at the top of the neck indicates where the string is fastened. The strings are lifted by a noose with a tassel at the end of it so that they can vibrate freely. The large arched harp looks like it is a 14-string harp. She uses both of her hands to manipulate the strings and instrument to play the correct pitch. 2 of the women are clothed while 1 is not. Women have been performers in Egypt for a very long time, and these ladies have headpieces on for the performance and are all standing while they play. A Muslim is supposed to perform the salat. to glorify God and give thanks 5 times a day. Currently, they are notified it is time to pray from the minaret of the local mosque by a loudspeaker. In years past, the muaddin sang the adhan or call to prayer to summon the faithful at fixed hours to pray. This painting is by Jean-Léon Gérôme and shows the city in the background. The muaddin is standing alone on the tower, about to call everyone in the nearby vicinity to pray. There is still a call to prayer today, but it is now digitally played for the Egyptian people. This is a way music is tied to religious expression in Islam, even though music is not considered a normal part of worship in Islam. From the 18th dynasty, 1550 to 1292 BC, this musician is from a wall relief from the tomb of Patenemheb. He is a blind musician who is sitting on the ground playing an 8-stringed harp with a finial made to look like a falcon's head. Meals, relaxed conversations, and every ritual was naturally accompanied by music in ancient Egypt. The intent of the performance changed according to the ceremony or event happening, and so did the station of the musicians. Priests would accompany rituals, and those who played at rich families' houses were likely of the lower class. Some were connected to the household they performed in, while some were going door to door. These musicians were often blind and had no other means for an income. From the 19th dynasty, 1292 to 1190 BC, a funerary dance with 8 women and 2 girls. They are all shown dancing, hitting tambourines, and wearing long, transparent clothing. Castanets are being played by the girls while they dance. Dancers are coming their way, male mourners, all with their heads thrown back and arms in the air in anguish. The dance and music are used to scare away evil beings threatening the deceased in the afterlife. They were considered best exorcised by frightening them with a sudden cacophony of clamoring, accompanied by music, and the burial was the best time for it to happen, since the body was most vulnerable at that point. Music played an integral part of this ritual and served a functional purpose in the funeral practices of these ancient Egyptians. Kulthum in a common pose in which she stood when she sang. She was the most well-known and famous Egyptian singer in the 20th century. She became a symbol of the country in Arabic music as the musical identity of Egypt was shifting during the post-colonial era into a new and intentional direction, of which Kulthum was a major arbiter of change. She continued to stay active professionally until 1975 when she passed away. Al-Kindi, circa 790 to 874, an Arab music theorist from the 9th century, wrote a treatise on his tone system based on cosmological ideas. His tone system was diatonic and based on Pythagorean tuning. Essentially, it was comprised of minor and major seconds. Abu al-Faraj al-Farabi, circa 870 to 950, was an Arab music theorist who wrote what became the current Arab music theory. Of the surviving music theoretical writings from the 10th to 13th century, the philosopher al-Farabis are the most important. Around this time, in the Mashriq, which is Western Asia and Eastern North Africa, the traditional Arab tone system is steadily being replaced by the Persian system to mathematically define its pitches with the Pythagorean tuning system. Al-Farabi was likely born in Turkestan, Kazakhstan, around 870. Most of his training came from Baghdad, Iraq, where he lived a strict, temperate, and solitary life. Not much is known about his life in Baghdad. He lived in Aleppo, Syria, during the last years of his life. Al-Farabi's most influential work on music is Grand Book of Music, a treatise that shows his deep thought and depth of knowledge on the subject. There are 3 main sections of the work, preceded by a long introduction that covers topics like musicality, music education, how human beings are affected by music, and acoustics. The first section details the physics involved with music, the quote-unquote new tone system that comes from the Persians, and musical time. The second section deals with musical instruments. The lute, rabab, and several other string instruments are discussed. He shows how the tone system can be applied to some of the instruments. The third section is about melody and rhythm. He discusses the traditional Arab rhythmic cycles. He covers topics like composition, how to pair text with melodies, and how human beings are affected by melodies. Al-Farabi's ideas were not based on cosmology. He thought music was a purely human form of expression. Having spent much of his treatise discussing the computation of pitches and the new tone system's detailed structure, he wrote about a new component of his theory. It was called the Wasta al-Zalzal, or Zalzal's third. It is the interval halfway between the minor and major third. It is one of the most idiomatic components of Arab music. It was named after the famous and influential musician named Zalzal. It was more than likely used before this time in Middle Eastern music, but previous music theorists like Al-Kindi did not think it had a place in traditional Arab music um, in the music system. Al-Farabi was the first music theorist who documented the use of the middle third in practice. His contribution to rhythm was a major change to the previous approach. Before his treatises, rhythmic patterns were represented by poetic meter. He began to think of rhythm in terms of beats being basic units of time, and however many time units there are indicates the duration of a rhythmic pattern. He considers both beats and rests to be time units. He describes 7 rhythmic cycles in his treatises, but does not distinguish between heavy and light beats, the doom and the tak. He does, however, describe ways in which the basic rhythmic patterns can be varied. Al-Farabi laid the groundwork for the modern Arab music system by recording Zalzal's third for the first time, recording the modes used at the time, and fundamentally changing the metric understanding of rhythm in music. Musical authenticity has been a large concern for listeners and critics in Egypt. Some critics argue that there is a shared background of the musicians who embody this authenticity. They all had received Muslim religious education, had been taught to read the Quran, to recognize the beauty of the Arabic language, and to know and sing the appropriate religious songs at all types of religious and special occasions. They were min al-mashayikh, people with a religious and educated background. The belief that one needed to be one of the mashayikh to possess traditional music authenticity persisted throughout the 20th century. Raja al-Naqash, a music critic, wrote of Kulthum, quote, "There is no doubt that Kulthum's link with our artistic heritage is her drive for the importance of religious song. She did not forget that she came from the Egyptian village, that she learned the Quran, that our artistic history is filled with religious song, and that religious sensibilities are a basic part of the feelings of the Egyptian people." Other solo singers that were originally trained as reciters of the Quran but had a career as both religious and amorous singers were Yusuf al-Manyalawi, Salama Ijazi, both of those singers. The sound of their music was familiar to Arabic audiences and they became widely popular. Born around 1904, Kulthum was the most well-known and popular 20th century singer in the Arab world. She was born into a poor family living in rural Egypt. Her father was a Quran reader who made extra income by singing at celebrations such as weddings. As a child, she performed with her father and brother in Egyptian Delta villages and towns. Egypt gained independence from the Ottoman Empire in December 1914, leaving it to confront a post-colonial identity. Kulthum had taken over the popularity of Cairo's well-known singers by 1928 after starting her career there 6 years earlier in 1922. On the first Thursday night of each month, Kulthum held a concert on her radio show hosted by Radio Cairo. It was listened to by millions of people in the Arab world each month. The concert would sometimes last 5 or 6 hours. The Egyptian President Nasser once rescheduled a speech so it would not conflict with one of her concerts. This radio show served to unify the country starting in 1935 by addressing the question of what Egypt's music identity would be in post-colonial years. Young singers imitated her singing style and performance practice. She had a part in composing and writing the verses and melodies she sang as well. Ugnia was one of the styles of vocal music she performed on the radio. In the 1950s, music broadcast by the radio was given restrictions and had to follow Egyptian cultural policies. Ugnia songs were supposed to last between 4 and 10 minutes. Instrumental introductions were required. The melody had to be flexible with a small to medium melodic range, so no register change was necessary to sing it. The rules of the maqam should be followed and simple harmony was acceptable. Lyrics had to be of a certain quality, and musicians were expected to be professionally trained and have the ability to read music notation. She was not a soprano singer. Her alto voice was flexible and powerful with a wide range. She had a consistent tone in all registers, and her voice became warmer and slightly nasal as she got older. Her voice control was phenomenal, and she articulated clearly while she sang the lyrics of her songs. Kulthum set high standards for her lyrics and preferred texts by poets like Ahmad Saki and Ahmad Rami. She was especially gifted in interpreting love ballads and qasaid on poetic texts in classical Arabic, for which she was praised throughout the Arab world. Her skill in knowing how to repeat verses, improvising variations, embellishments, and ornaments while maintaining the musical tension and the listener's ear was evident to those who heard her sing. Kulthum was able to stay at the top of the music industry until her death in 1975. She kept up with the main source of music entertainment dispensation at the time. She started with records and went to radio, followed by film and television. The radio was used from the 1930s and was the main musical listening source for most people in their homes. The invention of music cassettes in the 1980s ended radio being the main employer of musicians and decider of popular Arabic music. The content on the radio was controlled by those in power, but cassettes could be used by anyone with a small studio. Many new genres entered the market after that, including politically biased songs and music influenced by Western music while still retaining Arabic qualities. This type of music was popular with the youth and working class groups. To this day, Kulthum is a beloved figure in Egyptian history.